Okay. Can everyone hear me? Just checking. I'm not wearing one of those. Yeah, awesome. Okay. So, hi everyone. My name is Brinke, and I'm very excited to speak here at Devworld. And this session is going to be about Data API Builder. And in the next 30 minutes, we're going to talk about it because it can fix a very boring part of our jobs, which is actually building very boring APIs. And yeah, you're going to learn today what do I define as a boring API, but also, what is Data API Builder? How does it work? How can you use it? What are its features, etc. So let's get started. That's the wrong slide. Okay, I don't know. So, like I said, my name is Brinke. I live here in Apeldoorn in the Netherlands, and I'm a senior software engineer and a knowledge officer at Arcadie. I do a lot of .NET and like .NET development, Microsoft development, like .NET, C#, Azure. But as you can see, I've also done a lot of app development, cloud, DevOps, front-end, etc. For those that don't know us, Arcadie is an agile software company based here in the Netherlands, in Zwolle, where more than 60 Arcadians guide organizations into higher gear every day. We do a lot of Microsoft tooling. We use a lot of front-end development, UX, UI design. We have a booth here, so if you want to visit us, we're right over there. Okay, so we have a tight schedule. We have around 30 minutes. So what are you going to learn? So first, I want to talk about what is a boring API. Then we're going to talk about Data API Builder. We're going to talk about advanced usage. We're going to talk about hosting. And finally, we're going to be finishing up with some conclusions, some resources, etc., and some final questions as well. Okay. So a boring API. I'm very curious if you guys kind of, understand and have seen this before, have built things like this before. So a boring API to me is basically your average data API. Like we have a client that needs to store some data in a database, and so we decide to build an API because clients should not have direct database connections. So this API basically takes data to store, it takes a request to retrieve data, kind of like create, read, update, delete, that kind of stuff. And so the API is simply a wrapper around the database. Some common examples are things like like a fitness tracking app. You want to maybe track your goals, you want to track your high scores, etc. Maybe you want to have like a simple inventory management system so you can track product quantities. The API doesn't need to be all that complicated for that. Maybe a simple customer support ticketing app that you build yourself, maybe like a to-do list application that we always build. All of these things can have very rich or very, very normal front-end applications, or whatever, doesn't matter, but the API is just something you with REST or GraphQL that interacts with the database. Do you guys kind of recognize what I'm saying here? Like, you've built this kind of stuff before, I see a lot of nodding heads. So there's nothing really wrong with building stuff like this. There's nothing wrong with having fun with building stuff like this. It's just, to me, that there's a lot of steps involved to set this up reliably, right? We need to create a repository. We set up the folder structure. We choose your framework. We choose the language. We need to set up the database. We set up database migrations. We write endpoints to interact with that database. You set up CI/CD. You've probably written some tests, right? Because we all do. We deploy. But that's not it. Nowadays, we need to manage our applications. We need to keep them updated. There's OS updates. There's framework updates. There's package updates, security stuff. And to me, it's all of this for a simple database wrapper. Do you guys kind of recognize this issue? Yeah, I see a lot of nodding heads. Awesome. So to me, this is just too much. Just for simple applications, I want to use a different thing, a different tooling, so I can actually focus on the fun stuff, on the hard problems. So we're going to use Data API Builder for this. So Data API Builder is an open source product. It's built by Microsoft. And what it basically does is it generates an API for you at runtime based on the entities you choose to expose from your database. So as you can see here in this image, Data API Builder basically replaces that custom build API. And it takes only seconds to set this up. What you give the API Builder is you initialize a configuration file. You tell it, here's my database. And please expose the book table and the author table. Here's some authentication settings. Here's some feature settings. And you start, and you're done. It takes seconds instead of hours or a lot more time to manage and make these applications yourself. So it's important to know, it is a tool. It's not a framework or a library. So it doesn't output any code. It's not that you end up with an application you run. You have a configuration file, you start, and at runtime, like internally, it has this server. So it's not something that you program with, it's a tool you enable, like VS Code, like your tooling, etc. So it's a database-first approach. Many databases are supported as well, right? So you have SQL Server, you have Cosmos DB, Azure SQL, Postgres, MySQL, etc. And it's open source, like I already said. So this is not a new thing in the market, right? There's like, if you want to compare it a little bit to Firebase, perhaps, this is kind of the same idea. But there's also Postgres, and there's Hasura, I believe. These kind of tools exist already. The thing with Data API Builder is that there's like absolutely no vendor lock-in as well. And it also supports a whole lot more databases. So you can run this on-premise if you want. You can run this on the Azure cloud. You can run this on AWS. Lidl has a cloud. You can run it there. There's everywhere where you want, you can run this. There's loads of features, and it uses open source tooling under the hood. So let's talk about those features. So filtering, sorting, pagination, all of these things are taken care of for you. There's authentication and caching support. There's a built-in OpenAPI document for a really nice tooling. On my blog, I have a lot of posts about OpenAPI if you're interested. There's Swagger UI. There's a built-in GraphQL playground. And then it supports tables, views, and stored procedures. So if you kind of want to do some custom things, views and stored procedures can help you out. It runs everywhere, like I said, on-premise, or also on any cloud. And there's Docker support. And finally, there's Azure Static Web Apps integration if you want to run it in Azure. We're going to talk more about that later. Funnily enough, after my session, Rick van den Bos is giving a session about static web apps. So if you're interested and want to learn more, just keep sitting there. He'll tell you everything about it. Let's take a little look. So Data API Builder is like a server. It's a tool. It doesn't really have a front end. But you do have, like I said, tooling available for you. So this is Swagger UI. Anyone recognize this? Yeah, a lot of nods, So this is like a nice UI where you can see all the endpoints that are generated. You can test them out, etc. And the same for GraphQL. So for GraphQL, you have like this banana cake pop is what it's called. I didn't come up with that name. But here you can try out your GraphQL queries and just have some fun and try out everything around your API that's generated for you. So how does this work? How do we get started with Data API Builder? Because my point is that this is a lot faster and takes just way less time than building everything custom yourself, especially with all of the features I mentioned. So we simply have to install it. We can download an executable or do it in Docker, but here I'm going to use the .NET CLI. So we install it. Then we call dab init, so it initializes the configuration file. We pass the database type we want to use, so SQL Server perhaps. We pass in a connection string from an environment variable. And now we need to tell it, so what entities, what endpoints do you need to create for me? Do I want? So we say dab add book, and we have now a book entity. It's mapped from the DBO books table. And the permissions are anonymous star. So anyone without being logged in can do anything. You don't want it in production. But you could use different roles here, anonymous and authenticated, but also your custom roles defining your tokens. For example, like librarian read or librarian delete and that kind of stuff. So you can be quite exhaustive with what kind of security settings you want. And that's it. You run this, you run dab start, in milliseconds it starts up, and your API is ready. You can call curl, like HTTPS localhost 5001, API books, and in JSON, the contents of your table will be returned to you. And this saves you a whole lot of time for simple, CRUD applications. So next, the configuration file, right? This is kind of the bread and butter. This is where the magic happens. It's the only thing you need. So the configuration file is a JSON schema, and it's basically in 4 different sections. So we have a data source. How should DAB connect to your data source? So what database are we using? Are there specific database settings? What's the connection string? There's data source files. We're not going to talk about that today. It's a bit too complex for the time we have. But you can connect one instance of DAB to like multiple database sources. You could say, I want the book to be retrieved from Postgres. I want the authors to be retrieved from SQL Server. Or you just use everything Postgres and have one instance and multiple databases exposed. There's runtime options for caching, REST and GraphQL, the host, the telemetry, loads of options. And then there's the entities. And this is where you're going to spend most of your time. Right? There's entities that you can expose, because by default it exposes nothing. It's secure by default. There's relationships between entities, right? Like an author writes books, so you can do advanced querying. We'll look at that in a bit. There's permissions, like I said before, where specific roles can perform specific actions on entities. And there's mappings. Maybe you can create like a little anti-corruption layer, or in the database it's called book ID, and you want to call it identifier API. So here you can create mappings between these kind of things. OK, so let's take a closer look at a simple entity. This is basically the result of what we ran before, where we added the book entity, right? So we're going to get the, let me get a little bit out of the way. So we're going to create a new entity called book. It's the source is the object DBO books. This is a table, because it also supports views and stored procedures. We enable GraphQL, we enable REST, and the permissions are anonymous star. Quite simple, but now you have your API for books. OK, so let's say that we actually want to use this. Let's use DAB. How do we do this? What are our options? Because these need to be, they need to work well in order to replace something that we would normally build custom. So with REST, we have HTTP-based CRUD operations where we can get a list of books, create a new book, get a specific book by ID, delete a book, the stuff that we already know. Then there's also OData. People here unfamiliar with OData? Couple of hands, great, OK. So OData is basically like a library. You can implement this in loads of frameworks with common API operations, right? So we see like a question mark with a $ select. And that tells us, well, I want all the books, but only the ID and the title. And there's also like filtering, so you can like say, I only want books with the name Hello World in it. I want to order by first and after for pagination, all that kind of stuff. But maybe you want to do a little bit more advanced querying, right? Maybe you want to use GraphQL. So GraphQL, instead of using REST, where the server decides exactly what data is going to be returned, GraphQL decides it on the client. So here we can write a query that says, I want all the books with the ID and the title. And that's pretty interesting, that the client can have a very rich querying experience. But that leads us to the next point. What if we want to do something more advanced, right? What if we want to say, I want all the authors, but only their names, but actually also give me all of their books, but only the title? That's quite a weird REST endpoint to write, very specific. We don't really want to do that. So GraphQL lends itself really well to this kind of problem. So how do we enable this? Maybe building this custom is quite some work. How do we do this in DAB? First, we have to add the author. Let's say we already did this, like DAB add author. And then we call DAB update author, create a new relationship called books. And then we're going to say to the target entity book we set up earlier, and the cardinality of many, right? So one author has many books. This will create the following JSON in your configuration file, right? So you're going to get an author entity from the source DBO authors, relationship books, target entity book, cardinality many. And there's a lot of options there as well. And that's all you need to do, well, to execute that query on the left. So I think that's a really, really nice way to get a bit better querying experience. I want to do a little demo. And while we do that, let me just have a little look at this architecture overview together. So on the left, from left to right, we basically give it a configuration file. And then we also need to give it a relational schema, your database connection string of Postgres, for example, or your GraphQL schema if you're using like NoSQL, like Cosmos DB. At runtime, DAB is going to grok all of this. It's going to think about it. And then it's going to end up with REST methods and GraphQL schemas, so you can use REST and GraphQL and stuff like that. That's basically all there's to it. So let's do a fun demo. So this demo is going to be books and authors, right? So a book has a title, an author, a genre, publication date, image URL, which is, of course, written by an author that has a name, a birth date, a bio, an image URL, stuff like that. OK, let me switch to my demo here. There we go. My mouse isn't on. There we are. OK, so in the back, can you guys see this? Is it OK? Awesome. Great. So library demo. So here we have books, like The Way of Kings, Red Rising, Pronouncing Azure Correctly, the definitive guide. This is all done by REST endpoints. And then we have authors, Brandon Sanderson, Pierce Brown, John Skeet, Marko Zanovic. And this is all done with GraphQL, right? And now I've implemented in the simulator authentication mode of DAB that we can simply change roles. Really nice. By default, we're currently anonymous. Users can only read. I'm going to try to delete a book. 403, deleting book failed. Right? It's not allowed. But I can also log in. And now I would be able to be authenticated. And now I can create and update data. I can also be an administrator. And now I can actually delete data. So let's actually first take a look at some more GraphQL. Because here we can see the author, right? All of their details. but also the books that they've written, right? And this is all done via a very simple GraphQL query. Let me just grab it for you. Query request. There's no payload for this thing. Ah, there it is. So, okay, this is quite difficult to read, I suppose. We're going to call a query, get author by primary key. We're going to grab it, and then we're also going to grab the books and everything related to it. And the way this works is we're sending a header, x ms API role admin. So this is now telling Dab in development mode, like, hey, I don't want to fess and like set up a whole authentication system for development. I'm an admin now, and then it will just work. And now I would also be able to, for example, delete Red Rising and delete Pierce Brown. And then, for example, I can log out again and try that again. I get errors again. OK? So like I said, you get Swagger UI out of the box. So here you have like a nice list of all of my endpoints. You can get a list of authors, for example. There's loads of options here for my filter and select specific properties. Let's just not mess with that. Let's just call the endpoint like it is. And here we can see Brandon Sanderson, John Skeet, Marko Zonovic, stuff like that. Quite simple, but a very nice way to see what Dab is doing. The same thing with like the GraphQL playground. We have a little query here. I want all the authors with their name and their bio, but also their books with their title. I can run this, and now we have like, what I just requested. So that's kind of the Dab side of things. But let's have a quick look at the configuration. Can I get a thumbs up if this is readable in the back? That's a lot of thumbs up. Awesome. So configuration file. This is all there is to Dab and to get it to work. There's a schema that helps us with validation. There's a data source. So in this case, it's database type Microsoft SQL Server. The connection string is stored in an .env file. We're running in Docker at the moment. And there's caching is enabled in memory for all entities by default for 10 seconds, just to help us with some performance. REST and GraphQL are enabled as well. So REST endpoints are running on /API. GraphQL is running on /GraphQL. And there's the host options as well. The current mode is development, for that simulator mode. There's CORS options for letting my front end talk to Dab. And the authentication provider, like I said, is simulator. We can change this to a lot of different options. For now, we'll keep it at simulator. And here's the author with the permissions, which I kind of want to highlight to you here. So the permissions of the author is as follows. If you're the admin, you can perform any action. If you are authenticated, so you're sending a valid token, you can create, update, and read. And if you're anonymous, you can read. It's pretty simple. I mean, if I had to build this in like ASP.NET Core, with the authentication system, I'd need to write a lot more code to get that to work versus just filling out a simple array. Of course, with a custom-built API, you have a lot more options. But again, this is a simple API. This would suit your needs. And the same thing with relationships here. A relationship to books with the cardinality of many. Awesome. That's it for the demo right now. Let me just switch back. All right. There we go. And there we go. OK. I see I'm actually quite good on time. Is there a question so far? Yeah. I'll come closer to you, so otherwise we have to move the microphone over.
Yeah, great. I was curious about when there's a difference between the GPA entity and your domain model. How would that work with API?
Right. So the question is, if I understand you correctly, like how does it work if there's, for example, a domain entity and a database entity and there's differences between them? So you're kind of talking from like a domain-driven design kind of perspective, I'm thinking. Yeah. So in this case, basically your database is also your domain, because there's not. You can add mappings to kind of add an anti-corruption layer, name properties differently. But for the rest, there's not really a domain kind of side, because there's just an API generated on the database part. And this is fine. Like this is a great conclusion, actually, to say, in that case, Dab doesn't suit my needs. I need domain code. Let's not try to make this work for scenarios for which it's not made. Right? So it's a really good question. But for simpler scenarios where you're like, oh, my database is my domain, this can work really, really well. Thank you. Really good question. OK. Let's talk about some advanced usages. Let's talk about hosting as well. So how can I run custom code? It's a question I get all the time, so I just want to get it out of the way. What if you want to do something custom? Let's say it's a great application, right? But when a book gets created, I want to call like an external server somewhere in the cloud that validates if the book exists or is correct or if the ID of it is valid, whatever. How do I write custom code in DAB? You can't. You cannot do that. That is the simple answer. So how do we get around this? And actually, the answer to that, to me, is a very interesting architectural approach to this problem. Let's say like 90% of our applications are probably just kind of gets, right? In standard applications, we're just retrieving data from the server, and the special stuff is business logic that happens when we modify data, create data, etc. Just kind of at a baseline. Don't talk to me about statistics. I don't know about that. The user might go to API management, right? So there's API management in front of it, and API management says, well, okay, we're just getting books. We're just getting books. Let's just go to Data API Builder, because we have to write zero code for that. Goes to the database, goes back to the user. But for specific endpoints, like creating books, updating books, we could actually go ahead and say, well, we're not going to use, where is this not working? OK, it's not working anymore. Let's say we want to create a book. Then we're going to go to API management, and API management can send us to like an Azure function, or an AWS Lambda, or the Google Cloud equivalent, or on-premise. Like, this is not a Microsoft specific. You can run this anywhere. And the Azure function could simply take in an HTTP request with the book, perform a request to some validation server, like a couple lines of code, and then put it in the database, or forward a request to Data API Builder, which then finishes the request. So I find this very interesting architecturally, because now we only need very few specific lines of code for the actual business logic, and everything else is handled by DAB, which can just help you write applications faster. Of course, this doesn't work for any application. Would I use DAB for like banking apps? No, it is definitely not done for that. You shouldn't do that. But for loads of other like thingies that we're building, like normal applications, this can definitely work. So what if you want to secure your application? Anyone can retrieve all books. Awesome, but not everyone should delete all the books. So how do we deal with that? Well, we could let API management handle the authentication part and let DAB do authorization. But if you're not using that, if you're not using API management, Data API Builder can also do authentication. So we could, for example, use EasyAuth, which is supported by like Azure Static Web Apps. But we can also use Entra ID, formerly known as Azure Active Directory. And if you're using Microsoft technologies, this integrates. It's very, very nice. But if you're not using Microsoft stuff, what do you do then? So what do? You simply use the JSON Web Token support. So you can simply run any identity server, like a modern one, and let DAB integrate with that. So now we're authenticated. How do I get authorization to work? So there's built-in roles, anonymous and authenticated. But there's also custom roles that are defining your tokens. So a token contains a role librarian. And now we can set up that permission system to say, well, the librarian can do these actions, like we saw with the admin, where only the admin is allowed to delete stuff. There's also item security. So maybe the authenticated user should not be allowed to retrieve all the rows in the database. Maybe they should only be allowed to retrieve books that are, I don't know, less than 15 years old. So item security allows you in the configuration file to kind of extend the query that is executed. It's like, say, like where the book publication date is newer than 15 years. And now the authenticated users will only see those items. Field security is kind of the same, where instead of security by row, we can do security by column. So we can say specific columns should not be returned for specific users and roles. OK. So how do you host it? You're interested. You might want to have a little look on the weekend or whatever. But I want to deploy it to the cloud or wherever. How do I do that? Well, you can simply run the executable. You can run the .NET tool. But I would recommend that you use it in Docker. So you can get the Docker image. And that allows you to host it everywhere, right? You can do it on-premise on Kubernetes if you want. But there's AKS, and every cloud has their own Kubernetes and like serverless or managed Docker hosting platform. So you can just run it in all of these. So let's get this all together. Let's say, OK, we're going to use DAB. And for the front end, we're going to use Azure Static Web Apps. So if you're not familiar with that, stay here after this session. Rick is going to teach you all about it. But basically, the short version is it allows you to host your front-end applications. And it has integration with the API platform. So what you can say is when calls from API, they should go to Azure Functions or Azure Container Apps or Azure App Service. But now we would still need to host DAB in one of those platforms. So we would still need to create an Azure Container App and host it there. That's still kind of annoying. So Azure Static Web Apps has integration with Data API Builder. So you can simply say, Azure Static Web Apps, please connect to this database. And now calls that go to /Data API go to Data API Builder, and calls that can go to /API might do some of that custom business logic I talked about earlier. Again, quite an interesting architectural approach. OK, some resources, finally. So the conclusion, Data API Builder is an ideal replacement for simple data APIs. It's feature-rich, it's secure, it's easy to use, open source, and it runs everywhere. Extending it is also very easy, combined with cloud or on-premise services. And finally, its integration with Azure Static Web Apps lends itself really well to a powerful web application development experience. If you want, you can scan that QR code. It leads you to the blog post for everything that I talked about today. The roadmap, if you're interested in that. So there's going to be better OData support with more features from OData coming. There's going to be Azure Container Apps integration. If you're on the Azure platform, I think this is going to be really, really big. And there's a lot more coming as well. Finally, some resources. Feel free to take a picture here. Some links to the documentation, the links to the stand-up videos that the team made, the source code on Data API Builder on GitHub, the samples. And finally, if you want to run the demo that I showed you today, I have a lot of other demos as well in that repo. You can find it on my GitHub page. All right, that's it for today. Thank you so much for attending. Just finally, if you think, wow, that sounds really interesting, or wow, what a cute logo, I have loads of stickers. So if you're a sticker fan, come get some here, come get some at the booth. And yeah, do we still have time for some questions? A couple minutes, maybe? 1 minute. Yeah. A little louder, please.
If you are deleting a column,
yeah.
will it throw an exception, or can you configure it to be forgiving and just return null?
So if you return a column, can you then still make it return like a null value instead of? Right. No, if you delete a column, then it also is removed from the API response. I think that answers your question. Yeah. OK. Thank you so much, everyone, and enjoy the conference.